God and the Intelligence in Modern Philosophy by Fulton Sheen. Introduction by G.K. Chesterton. Introduction. In this book, as the modern world generally, the Catholic Church comes forward as the one and only champion of reason. There was indeed 100 years ago a school of free thinking which attacked Rome by an appeal to reason. But most of the recent free thinkers are, by their own account, rather than by ours, falling from reason even more than from Rome. One of the best and most brilliant of them, Mr. Bernard Shaw, said only the other day that he could never entirely agree with the Catholic Church because of its extreme rationalism. In this perception, he is at least quite rational. That is, as we poor rationalists would say, he is quite right. The Church is larger than the world, and she rightly resisted the narrow rationalists who maintained that everything in all the world could be approached in exactly the same way that is used for practical material things in this world. But she never said that things were not to be approached, or that reason was not the proper way to approach them, or that anybody had any right to be unreasonable in approaching anything. She defends the wisdom of the world as the way of dealing with the world. She defends common sense and consistent thinking and the perception that 2 and 2 make 4, and today she is alone in defending them. I remember a romance of a rambling but rather interesting sort which comes out in one of the strange and sensational series that used to be produced by the late W.T. Stead. It began with the incident of a modern skeptical heroine going into a confessional box and telling the priest that she did not believe in his religion. He asked her what she did believe in, and she said reflectively, "Well, I don't believe in the Bible, and I don't think I believe in the immortality of the soul. And I'm not sure that I believe in God," and so on. And the unmoved cleric replied, "I didn't ask you what you didn't believe, but what you do believe." "Well," said the lady, "I believe that 2 and 2 make 4. "Very well, then," said the priest, "live up to that." That always struck me as a good story, though it was in an odd setting, but it had a still more odd sequel. In those last days of the 19th century, the skeptical lady did make the quotation from the multiplication table, assuming it to be a minimum which nobody could possibly help believing. Yet somewhere about the same time the typical prophet of that period, Ibsen, may have been writing the words, "Who knows that 2 and 2 do not make 5 in the fixed stars?" One would have thought that in an age of such fine and finished rationalists, somebody would have been rational enough to answer him with the obvious question, "If you are not sure there are any fixed facts, how do you come to be sure there are any fixed stars?" The very existence of many fixed stars is only proved by mathematics. That is, it is made by making 1,000,000 times over the assumption that 2 and 2 make 4, but curiously enough, I have never heard of this sort of rational reply made to a doubt like that of Ibsen's, except by the Catholic Church. The mathematical formula may be the maximum of the lady's belief and the minimum of the priest's philosophy, but he is more ready to stand up for his philosophy than she is for her religion. That sort of lady today is running after every raving fad of mysticism and credulity, so long as it opposed to reason. She is following M. Corey, who says it is better to call things better because they are worse. She is running after Mrs. Eddy, because Mrs. Eddy denounces a toothache which does not exist for existing. She is running after Professor Einstein because he is credited with saying that the straight lines are crooked and that the parallel lines meet and that a yard may measure more one way than another. She is running after the pragmatists because they have a proof that all proofs are worthless. She is running after the Eastern mystics because they are supposed to say that nothing is good because it is everything, or else that everything is good because it is really nothing. But the little priest is still sitting in his confessional box, believing that 2 and 2 make 4, and living up to that. The question to which Dr. Sheen here applies the rational as opposed to the irrational method is the most tremendous question in the world, perhaps the only question in the world. For that reason I prefer to leave its intrinsic consideration to him, and these few words of introduction to deal with the method rather than the subject matter. The subject matter is the nature of God, insofar as it can be apprehended at all by the nature of man. As Dr. Sheen points out, the intellectual purity of the problem itself is much confused nowadays by a sort of sentimental version of the divine dignity of man. As in every other modern matter, the people in question seize on the sentiment without the reason for it. There is nothing particular about the objective anthropoid in a hat that anybody could be actually forced to regard him as a sacred animal, like a sacred cat or a sacred crocodile. This sentiment is a sediment. It is the dregs of the old dogma about a divine origin. They begin by bowing down to man as the image of God, and then forget the God and bow down to the graven image. Similarly, as he also points out, the question of yes and no is weakened with all that wearisome discussion about less and more, which has been made fashionable ever since the old fuss about evolution. It is the view that being is becoming, or that God does not exist yet, but may be said to be living in hope. The blasphemy is not ours. It is enough for us that our enemies have retreated from the territory of reason, on which they once claimed so many victories, and have fallen back upon the borderlands of myth and mysticism, like so many other barbarians with whom civilization is at war. G.K. Chesterton, July 1925. Chapter 1. The Problem. Modern philosophy has seen the birth of a new nation of God. There is nothing of greater importance, as there could be nothing more ultimate. Even the very attitude of one man to another, or of one nation to another, varies with the conception of God. The outlook on the world changes the moment the outlook on God changes. And if we had intellectual vigor enough to ascend from effects to cause, we would explain political, economical, and social phenomena less by credit sheets, balance of trades, and reparations than by our attitude towards God. The new idea of God has not burst upon the world with the suddenness of a new star. It has had its antecedents dating back over half a century. New scientific notions, increased faith in philosophy of progress, birth of new values and interpretations of life, love of novelty, dissolution of dogmas. Each has contributed its share to bring it into being. Now that it is born, it stands before the world not so much as a modified notion as a new creation, though coming from the past. It differs from all that has appeared in the past. It is, as it were, one of the novelties of evolution. It differs from the old even more than the Aphrodite differs from the sea from which she sprang. Its face is set in another direction. It brings man into greater prominence. It exalts him even to the extent of giving him a vote in the cosmic councils of the world. It is, in a word, the transfer of the seat of authority from God to man. But what is this new notion of God? It is God in evolution. God is not. He becomes. In the beginning was not the Word, but in the beginning was movement. From this movement, God is born by successive creations. As the world progresses, he progresses. As the world acquires perfection, he acquires perfection. He is therefore not the Alpha or the Omega of things, for his destiny and perfection lies hidden in the final evolution of the universe. Man is a necessary step in the evolution of God. The divine shows in him, as well as in God. One day it will manifest itself completely. Just as man came from the beast, God will come from man. The perfectibility of man implies the manifestation of divine. Man will be like God's. It is the purpose of this work to examine this new notion of God, but this problem cannot be adequately treated apart from another problem, which is intimately bound up with it. This other problem is the value of the intelligence. As men lost faith in the intelligence, they acquired faith in God of becoming. The modern God was born by the day the beast's intellectualism was killed. The day the intelligence is reborn, the modern God will die. They cannot exist together, for one is the annihilation of the other. But why the intimate relation between the two? Apart from the purely technical reason which centers round the analogical notion of being, there are two general considerations which englobe all others. The first is drawn from the universe, the second from God. There is in all things a first perfection in virtue of their own specific nature, because the specific being of one thing is not the being of another thing. One thing lacks the perfection of another. By the very fact that a lark is a lark, it must lack the perfection of a sunset. The perfection of every creature, then, is only relatively perfect, because it is only a part of the whole perfection of the universe, which includes the perfection of all particular things, such as one instrument in an orchestra is a part of the whole perfection of the harmony which issues from it. To remedy this imperfection, by which one nature excludes the perfection of another nature, there has been given to some creatures things another perfection, namely, the intellect, in the virtue of which it can know all things and possess within itself the perfection of other things, so that the perfection of the whole universe can exist in it. Man's ultimate end, according to Aristotle, consists in the knowledge of the order and cause of the universe, and for the Christian it consists in the beatific vision of God. For what is there which may not be seen in seeing him who sees all things? The intellect, then, is the perfection of the universe, because it can sum up all creation within itself. In doing this, it becomes the articulate spokesman of the universe and the great bond between brute matter and the infinite spirit. What happens then when a philosophy rejects the intellect? It breaks a link between the world and God, denies a hymn of divine praise to the Creator, and knocks the world into an unintelligible pluralism. There is yet another reason for the close relation of God and the intellect. This point of departure is the fact that man is the image of God. The nature of an image requires likeness in species. Thus the image of the king exists in the son, or at least the same specific accident, chiefly in the shape. Thus we speak of man's image in copper. Whence Hilary says pointedly that an image is of the same species. 1. It is manifest that species likeness follows the ultimate difference, but some things are like God's first, and most commonly because they exist, secondly because they live, and thirdly because they know or understand. And these last, as Augustine says, approach so near to God in likeness that among all creatures nothing comes nearer to God. It is clear, therefore, that intellectual creatures alone, properly speaking, are made in God's image. Since man is said to be to the image of God by reason of an intellectual nature, he is the most nearly like God according to that in which he can be best imitate God in his intellectual nature. Now the intellectual nature imitates God chiefly in this, that God understands and loves himself. Therefore, we see that the image of God is in man, inasmuch as man possesses a natural aptitude for understanding and loving God, and this aptitude consists in the very nature of the mind which is common to all men. What results from this image of God in man, in virtue of his intellect? This conclusion, that intensively and collectively considered, the human intelligence is more perfect than all other visible creation, because in it, as in no other creature, is found the capacity for highest good, viz., God. Being spiritual and capable of possessing the visible universe within in a spiritual way, it is already in potency for a knowledge of God, who is supreme good, a capacity which soon passes into act through reasoning on the visible things of the universe, which reveal the invisible God. Without the intelligence, the universe lacks its perfection, as without it man lacks his. Without it, man ceases to be not only the crown of visible creation, but even the image of God. We are like God inasmuch as we have an intellect. We are like beasts inasmuch as we have flesh. The denial of the intelligence is a denial of an infinitely perfect God, as a denial of an infinitely perfect God is a denial of the intelligence. The two problems are inseparable. But why study this problem in the light of the philosophy of St. Thomas? One reason, and that negative, certainly is the self-confessed bankruptcy of modern thought. No philosophical congress is complete today without the lecture on the confusion amid philosophers. The world is full of thinking, but there is no agreement in thought. There are philosophers, but there is no philosophy. There are distinguished men, but no man. Big heads, but no head. Heads of schools without schools. Leaders without followers. Societies without members. Speciarians' thought has been buried in the grave of the unknowable. The history of pragmatism is now being written as an exaggerated reaction against idealism. Italian neo-idealism has dissolved philosophy into history and melted reality into mind. Bergogian becoming is decaying, and a sort of philosophical biologism remains as its heritage. The hurry, the fever, the restlessness, the excitement which blind us to the divine in things leave nothing but a philosophy of action for men of action. Men are suffering from the fever of violent emotion, and so they make a philosophy of it. It is not Neo-Thomism which is criticizing modern thought. It is a modern thinker. Those who have most contributed to philosophical chaos are now assuming a pessimistic outlook for the philosophical future, which they have helped to create. Testimonies of modern thinking are abundant on this point. Speaking of this, contemporaries, George Santayana writes in his own excellent style, "There is much life in some of them. I like their water-colored sketch of self-consciousness, their rebellious egotism, their fervid reforms of phraseology, their peepholes through which some very small parts of things may be seen very clearly. They have lively wits, but they seem to me like children playing blind man's bluff. They are keenly excited at not knowing where they are. They are really here in the common natural world, where there is nothing in particular to threaten or lure them, and they have only to remove their philosophical bandages to see where they are. Professor Lovejoy remarks, "What the public want most from its philosophers is an experience of initiation. What it is intended into is often a matter of secondary importance. Men delight in being ushered past the guarded portals, in finding themselves in dim and awful precincts of thought unknown to the natural man, in experiencing the hushed moment of revelation, and in gazing upon strange symbols of which none can tell just what they symbolize. But where turn for sanity? Professor A. E. Taylor has given his answer. If philosophy, he says, is ever to execute her supreme task, she will need to take into more serious account not only the works of the exact science, but the teachings of the great masters of life. For us it means that it is high time philosophy ceased to treat the great Christian theologians as credulous persons whose convictions need not be taken seriously. If we are to be philosophers in earnest, we cannot afford to have any path which may lead to the heart of life's mystery blocked for us by placards bearing the labels of reactionary, unmodern, and their likes. That what is most modern must be best is a superstition which it is strange to find in a really educated man. A philosopher, at any rate, should be able to endure the charge of being unmodern with fortitude. Abelard and St. Thomas very likely would have failed as advertising agents, company promoters, or editors of sensational daily papers, but it may well be that both are better fitted than Lord Northcliffe to tell us whether God is or what God is. In short, if we mean to be philosophical, our main concern will be that our beliefs should be true. We shall care very little whether they happen to be popular with the intellectual proliferations of the moment. If we can get back to truth, we shall never mind having to go back a long way after it. This opinion is becoming more general. There is even now a decided willingness to turn the Philosophia Perennis and the long tradition of common sense over 25 years ago from Neo-Thomas was born. It met with violent opposition. Rudolf Eken wrote his Thomas von Aquino und Kant in Kampf Zweierwelten, denouncing the menace of the new philosophy. And in 1924, at the Philosophical Congress of Naples, the distinguished Neo-Thomas P. Gemelli occupied a platform with Professor A. Liebert of the Kentgesellschaft, the letter to recognize in the philosophy of St. Thomas a complement to critical philosophy, the former to show the necessity of such a complement. In other words, the time is at hand when modern philosophy, not only because of its own confessed bankruptcy, but also because of the inheritance merits of Philosophia Perennis, must take definite recognizance of the thought of St. Thomas. This brings us to the positive side of the philosophy of the angelic doctor, namely the fact that he is the first of modern philosophers. As M. Etienne Gilson of the University of Paris has put it, he is the first not because he has created the principle and invented the attitude in which we live, nor because all the directions of thought by which the 13th century prepared the modern epoch were concentrated in his works, but because he is the first Occidental of whom the thought is neither enslaved to dogma nor to a system. But there is yet another reason why the philosophy of St. Thomas is particularly useful at this moment. What are the two great problems with which modern philosophy is struggling? Are they not the immanence of God in the universe and the subjectivity of thought? All religion hangs on the first, and all science on the second. The divine and the human are in the balance with these two problems. But there is no philosophical system in existence which so completely and thoroughly treats and solves these questions as the Thomistic. In recent years, deep students have taken out of St. Thomas the fundamental principles which underlie his whole work. One of them is the real distinction between essence and existence. The other is the doctrine of realism in knowledge. The first has been called the fundamental truth of Christian philosophy, the second the cornerstone of philosophical reconstruction. Both of these fundamental principles are the solutions of the two vexed problems of modern thought. If solution of modern problem is a recognition for a philosophy which, in the strict sense, is neither ancient nor modern, but ultra-modern, then the philosophy of St. Thomas is preeminently suitable to modern times. It is ultra-modern because it is spiritual and is not subject to decrepitude and death. By this universality, it overflows infinitely in the past as in the future. The limits of the present moment, it does not oppose itself to modern systems, as the past to that which is actually given, but as something perennial to something momentary. Anti-modern against the errors of the present time, it is ultra-modern for all truth enveloped in the time to come. Intellectual restoration is the condition of economic and political restoration. Intellectual values are needed more than cosmic imaginings, and God is needed more than a new idea of God. If we look to the foundations, the superstructure will take care of itself. Thomistic intellectualism is the remedy against anarchy of ideas, riot of philosophical systems, and breakdowns of spiritual forces. The intelligence is life, and the greatest thing there is in life. This Thomistic principle is at once an expression of the ideal of modern philosophy and the very preventive against its decay. This work is divided into two parts. The first is an exposition without criticism of the modern grievances against the intellectualist philosophy, along with its attacks on any intellectual knowledge of God and the substitute notion, the God of becoming. The second part is a critical examination of the modern doctrines of the intelligence and God in the light of philosophy of St. Thomas. Chapter 2. The modern attack on the intelligence. A. Considered as a faculty. What is the purpose of the intellect? It is the faculty of the divine, the transcender of the contingent, the plaything of the contemplative. Or is it merely a primitive tool used crudely by men for want of a better instrument? Does not science itself demonstrate the truth of the latter alternative? At what age do we fix the appearance of men on earth? Is it not at the time when he manufactured tools and arms? The old query of Mulan Quignon is the remotest scientific evidence we have of that fact. Man first showed intelligence in manufacturing tools. Rather than this, we know nothing about intelligence on this earth, though it be a long stretch from this day and age to the quarry of Malanquignon. Is it not true that even today we still find men making and utilizing instruments, not exclusively instruments of necessity, it is true, but those of luxury and comfort? If, therefore, we could strip ourselves of all pride, and if, in order to define our species, we hold strictly to that which history and prehistory present us as the constant character of man and intelligence, we would not say perhaps Homo sapiens, but Homo faber. Speculation is a luxury, action is a necessity. To the latter, the intelligence is destined. It is the great right arm of mechanics, but being practical, it is alien to the needs of the thinker. It exists solely for human needs and is limited by them. It serves man for a time in his upward march of evolution, but sooner or later it is destined to be replaced by a faculty of the spirit. As men get out of the practical, the intelligence ceases to have value for them. Its imperialism of principle and mechanism of means stamps it as geometric and rigid. Everything which is evil is to be attributed to the intelligence, not only in the field of philosophy, but in that of politics and economics. Even the defeat of the German army, it has been said, was due to its intellectualism. In any case, its practical character excludes it from philosophy. To some other faculty than the intelligence, the philosopher must make his appeal.